Imagine facing this impossible choice: a life of violence or one of poverty. Tonight we look at new research revealing why that's the reality for too many single mothers and why leaving abusive relationships can be the hardest choice of all. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Virginia Trioli. We're coming to you live tonight from Sydney. Joining me on the panel, researcher of the report we'll be discussing tonight, author and renowned feminist Ann Summers, Labor Minister and domestic violence survivor Anne Aly, award-winning author and survivor Veronica Gorrie, anti-domestic violence campaigner Arman Abrahimzadeh, and author Jess Hill, who wrote the award-winning book See What You Made Me Do. Please make them all feel very welcome. And remember, you can stream this on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag, so please get involved in the discussions. Our first question tonight comes from Marty Wilson.
So it's because of men's use of violence that women are facing this terrible choice between staying in abuse or poverty and homelessness. Yet the societal message is still so often, why doesn't she just leave? Which places the responsibility with her. So I'm wondering what the panellists think could be done to shift the responsibility from the user of violence, to the user of violence, and how we could change the normalised narrative that expects women to physically leave the home when they're in an abusive relationship.
Marty, thank you. Ann Summers, the massive report that you've just published, in it you talk about the irresponsibility, that's the phrase you use, the irresponsibility of a society that encourages women to leave violent relationships but doesn't provide them with adequate and safe alternatives. That's pretty much where Marty's going this evening, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, what I try to say in the report and what motivated me to do this work and to do this research was the fact that I felt that the conversation about domestic violence in this country wasn't going anywhere. Rosie Batty did an incredible job in raising awareness of it. I think the issue is very much on the political agenda. We're very aware of it, but nothing's changed. And I felt one of the reasons that nothing has changed is that the data hasn't changed. We don't know enough about what's happening. And that is what motivated me to go and do this very in-depth research from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and get never before published data about just how bad it really is. Now, the data is mainly about women as victims, and that's what I looked at. There are certainly programs that are, I think, somewhat controversial as to whether or not the woman should stay in the home, and the man be made to leave. And that certainly sounds much fairer, but it's often not safer, and it's not practical. So I don't think that is the way. That is not the solution. It's certainly not the immediate solution. I mean, the immediate solution facing so many women. I mean, the numbers that I have, which are based on the ABS numbers, that there are 275,000 women in Australia in 2016. The number is probably about the same now, who live with a violent partner. 275,000. That's a lot of women. 90,000 of them wanted to leave but couldn't, many of them because of lack of money. So the ones who did leave and are now single mothers as a result, 185,700 of them who experienced violence, they were all married at the time they were experiencing the violence, but they left and became single mothers, and 50% of them are now living in poverty.
Let me just spool through a couple of the key findings, and it's a massive and weighty report, but they include the high number of women who experience violence and are now single mothers with kids under 18, the high number of women who wanted to leave but couldn't because they couldn't afford to, the high number of women who left but came back because they couldn't survive financially, and the women who were not in poverty before they left but were after leaving. So it's astonishing, and it's painting a picture and a connection, a nexus now between domestic violence and poverty that we haven't had before.
And I think that's probably the main takeaway that I hope people get from this report, and that is that, you know, for a long time it's been the presupposition has been that violence is the cause of domestic violence, and only poor people suffer it, and it happens in, you know, poor suburbs and everybody else, it's, you know, if it happens, it's just an occasional thing. That is not the case. I mean, we don't know the incidents via postcode, unfortunately, but I think if we did know, we'd be very shocked at how high the incidence is, regardless of where people live. What we do know is that leaving a relationship of whatever kind, I mean, some of the people that were looked at in an associated work that was done on Hilda's statistics, which are longitudinal ones and give us information over time, some of the men involved in that these women left were earning up to $600,000 a year. And those women's household incomes declined by as much as 45% after they left.
Let me get to the rest of the panel on this, and Marty's question in particular about expecting women to leave. Anne Ali, I know you've had a particular and personal experience of this, and we're happy to hear whatever you're prepared to share this evening. But what are your reflections on that question?
I think, Marty, to respond to your question, I think we need to be changing that question. We shouldn't be asking, why don't women leave? We should be asking, why do women have to leave? And then we should be asking, what happens when they leave? Why do they have to leave? And then what happens when they leave? If we start asking those two questions as a society, the answers that we'll get are very different to the answer of why don't women leave, I think. Let me tell you, it is the hardest thing I ever did in my life to leave. And I've done some pretty hard stuff, right? The most difficult thing I ever had to do in my life was leave. Because I had 2 children. I had 2 boys. I didn't want them to be without a father. And there's all this society expectation of, you know, children being raised, boys being raised with their father. I knew that I was leaving to lead a life of poverty. And the humiliation of walking into that Centrelink office and saying, I don't know how I'm going to feed my kids or myself, still sits with me 30 years on. After everything that I went through, the hardest thing was to leave. That's why women don't leave.
Let me turn to Veronica Gorrie on this. Veronica?
I just want to talk about the report, go back to the report. And so I did read your report, all 101 pages, I believe. And what I took from that was the exclusion of Aboriginal women. There's no data in relation to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander women. And also I found that your report was quite gender biased. Like, we're talking about women being victims right now, but men are also victims as well, and other people from the LGBTQI plus community, however they identify themselves, are victims as well. And your report only, the victim is only the woman. I found that upsetting as well. And as an Aboriginal person, like, it's about... Sorry?
No, just wait 1 second. I'll get a response.
I was asking Virginia if I could respond to
I'll get a response from Anne in a moment.
Yeah, I haven't finished yet, Anne. Yeah. So with Aboriginal people, we don't... I wished poverty was the only thing we had to worry about when we're dealing with domestic violence. It's not. The violence that is that we suffer at the hands of police when police turn up at a domestic violence incident is a whole nother level. Aboriginal women are deemed to be the perpetrators and are locked up, and our children are taken from us. That's not in your report, which I find upsetting. And although we're not in the report, the federal government have announced an action plan to address family violence and domestic violence within our communities without no data. And that's very telling. It's state-sanctioned violence.
Veronica, we've got a number of questions that take us to all of those points, so I hope to flesh them out as the evening goes on. And I will come back to you for a response in a moment if I can, Anne. But Arman, let me come to you and our question about women leaving, because we may get to your personal story a little bit later in the program. But how would you respond to Marty?
I think the way Minister Ali responded in
Anne,
terms of...
please call me Anne.
Anne.
Thank you.
Responded in terms of what happens to these women when they leave. That's been a a key component that's been missing, because we always talk about family and domestic violence and the different fronts that is being fought on. And I think now with the draft national plan being released, we've got 4 pillars that have been identified, and that's essentially prevention, the early intervention, the crisis end, but also the recovery, the post-crisis. Now that's been missing from that conversation for a long time, and you know, we saw that gap about 7 years ago, and that's why we went along in South Australia and established a foundation that actually addresses that gap and tries to assist women in order to carve a brand new path for themselves, a path that's free of violence and abuse.
And there are questions tonight that take us to the issue of post-crisis and the fact that we've perhaps front-end loaded the issue with warnings and exhortations for women to leave, but not provided them with the support to actually get out. Jess Hill, this question really is fundamental to the book that you wrote.
Yeah, Marty, thanks so much for the question. And when I was writing the book, it was so interesting how ingrained it was in me to foreground the victim that I had to switch around the chapters to put the perpetrators right up front, and that felt very unnatural. And a lot of my learning, and this comes particularly from victim survivors themselves, over the time has been to try to put the perpetrator back at the front of the sentence, you know, that we're talking, like it's just good English to put the subject of the sentence at the beginning rather, you know, so, and of course when we're talking in this kind of heterosexual framework, which is sort of where we're talking tonight because we're thinking about single mothers, you know, we talk a lot about women's safety. We have a women's safety summit. We have a plan for women's safety. We don't have a plan for men's violence. And it's, you know, when you don't have that lens on the actions of perpetrators, all you see is the resulting choices and the resulting behaviours, but it doesn't come back to what drove those behaviours. Those behaviours aren't operating in a vacuum. And I think, you know, it's difficult, the thing around, you know, why should women leave? I mean, part of one of the big awakenings I had when I finally got over all my own stereotypes was I just came to think, how on earth does she leave? And why, if he treats her so badly and seems to despise her, why doesn't he let her leave? Because actually this, when especially in terms of coercive control, but in most family violence, it's not just abuse, it's entrapment, you know? And as Anne says, like the act of leaving is utterly terrifying. And the women who leave often it's a high-stakes operation that takes planning and preparation because he will not let her leave and he may kill her for leaving.
Let me get to some other questions, but Anne, I'll just give you a moment just to briefly respond, if you can, to Veronica's criticisms.
Well, I mean, I have no argument with Veronica. The problem with the collection of the statistics that we use, the Personal Safety Survey, which is the federal government's survey every 4 years of violence and safety in Australia, and which includes domestic violence, does not include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at all.
Why? Why is it?
Well, the reason they give is they say it's a sampling problem. They can't get to remote communities. It's a household survey. This is their argument. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that's what the situation is. Similarly with LGBT.
I don't believe that it's because we don't matter, our lives don't matter, that they don't give a shit about Aboriginal people. They don't give a shit about Aboriginal victims, and I'm not bringing gender into it either, like you want to, Jess. It's not about men or women, and women come in all forms, okay? You know, but they don't care about Aboriginal.
I did well. I made the point that was a criticism. I criticised that point in what I wrote. Similarly with LGBTQ people who are included in the latest study, haven't been included in previous studies. So the study itself is evolving. This idea for having a separate plan for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is, I don't know. I don't know that I agree with that. I think I would be interested in what you think of that, whether or not that they should be integrated into the national survey. I think is the way to go.
I think we can do our own survey actually, and we can look after our own problems.
Well, we'll get to some questions,
particularly
to that in just a moment. And let me just go to some other questions because we have so many people in the room who have questions for you. And I can't tell you how many painful and shocking first-person stories we received for this program, so many of which we can't share with you for legal reasons. But let me bring in Janine Rees now. Janine, just give us a picture of what life's been like for you.
Thank you. I'm a survivor of an abusive relationship. I thought the hardest thing I'd ever do was to leave, but the abuse escalated exponentially after leaving. My 3 children and I couch surfed for 5 months. We had to pay 6 months' rent up front to secure a rental, which was every cent I had left. I now pay more in rent than I would in mortgage repayments in my own home. There is zero practical, financial, legal, housing or police help for survivors like my children and I. There is no accountability for perpetrators, as Jess points out. I did not choose to be abused, and I did not choose poverty.
Veronica, I want to turn to you on that. When it was your moment and your opportunity to leave as well, and you've been through, you know, some dreadful violence in your life as well. How impoverishing was that for you?
Well, just being an Aboriginal person, it's inherent. You're brought into this world black and broke, you know, and it's due to colonisation. Prior to colonisation, my people had an abundance on our traditional lands. So I blame everything on colonisation. But I want to talk about your report, and in terms of poverty, you don't mention the welfare card, the cashless welfare card that a lot of my people are forced to apply, use. And they're like, you're talking, you know, so much as they don't have any cash to spend. You know, like, how do we fix that? Do you have that in your report?
No, I don't, because I only talked about government payments. I mean,
that is a government payment,
I think it's a legitimate criticism that I didn't talk about that. But you know, I had to make choices about what I included, and I made my focus the payments that most people are eligible for or try to apply for when they leave a relationship.
And Ali, let me turn to you on that question, or just on the story that Janine tells there, and about the poverty that you immediately slot yourself into.
Yeah, it's. I think it's always front of mind when you're thinking about leaving, and you know, you think about leaving not once, not twice, but you think about leaving a lot, and you try to imagine what life is going to be like on your own as a single mum, and how you're going to make ends meet. I wasn't working. I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. You know, when you have to put half your shopping back at the grocery store, when you're going through the checkout, when you go to the bank and your bank balance is minus $6 and you don't know how you're going to feed your kids, you cannot help but kind of blame yourself and think that you put them in that situation because you couldn't handle being hit. You couldn't handle the abuse. And, you know, since I've spoken publicly about my own experiences, I have been incredibly privileged by having a lot of women come and disclose to me and talk about their experiences as well. And the similarities in women's experiences, you know, no matter what background they come from, no matter, you know, where they've come from or no matter how they left, is quite telling that we should know this stuff.
Arman, let me come to you, because you've got a personal story which is very well known to a lot of Australians, and the extremely violent death of your mother at the hands of your father and in a public place. But you grew up in a violent household long before that happened as well.
We did. I've got 2 sisters, and I guess the violence and abuse that happened at home was a normal thing, so you just don't question it. It's like having a meal. You don't question having breakfast or lunch or doing anything normal like that. It was part of life. But I guess things got to a point where we were essentially threatened to be killed in our own family home. And from there, we, within a matter of 48 hours, we kind of planned and knew roughly what we were going to do. But I guess you know, up until that point, we thought that we had some challenges, but it was when we left our family home, or when we fled the family home, that we started to realise that the challenges are out there now. When we left our family home, my mum didn't have a lot of family here, didn't have any family here. My dad's got a big family here, and so we started to realise that we were isolated. We started sleeping in the car, and we were homeless. So
we're just showing a photograph of your mum and your sister there to everyone who's watching, just to pay tribute to her. Jess Hill, I just quickly wanted to go back to Janine in just a moment and check, how you're going now. But these are stories that were incredibly familiar to you and that you replayed as well in your book too.
Yeah, and I just want to also just make a shout out. Janine is a great advocate and very committed, and there are so many people in this audience. I look around and see so many friendly faces, but also people who have done so much work in this area and who have battled for single mothers from every background for so long. I think that I want to take just a slightly different tack, and it's prompted by Janine's question because of the work Janine does, and that is to say that when you leave violence, it's like, as one very close friend described to me just before coming onto this program, you take a breath for a minute. You take a breath and you're like, I'm coming up from underwater and I'm coming into this new place, right? And then you feel like you've got a breath for the first time. Maybe you're starting to get some perspective about what's happened to you. Maybe you've got enough space just to catch that breath. And then the various systems that come in over you just push you back down underwater. And that's everything from Inju to Parents Next to, but particularly the family law system. And when I receive a lot of correspondence from victim survivors, I feel very privileged to be in contact with some of the most strategic and loving and intelligent people I've ever met. And what they are put through in the family law system and other systems is unconscionable. And it really is, as Anne states in the report, this is government-induced poverty. It's also government-induced abuse, really, to put it plainly, and in such a way that the very thing that you were stripped of, or that your abuser attempted to strip you of, which is dignity, you make the brave choice to leave. You are going to reclaim that dignity, reclaim it for you, reclaim it for your children, and then that dignity is taken back away. And your children see that not only were you degraded by your partner, but you're being degraded by the government. And the result of that is just catastrophic.
I've got some questions coming actually about payments and about the structured system that you look at very closely in the report, Anne. But I just want to mention here, if this discussion raises any difficult issues for you, the numbers for 1800-RESPECT and the Women's Crisis Line are there on your screen. The Men's Referral Service and Lifeline are also available to you. Our next question now comes from Leanne Ho.
Hi, I'm the CEO of Economic Justice Australia. We know from our community legal centres helping victims, survivors with Centrelink issues, that it's harder for them to escape violence and find safety without an independent source of income. However, social security was notably absent from the agenda of last year's Women's Safety Summit and currently not included in the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. My question for the panel, and particularly Minister Ali, Anne, is what will the new Labor government do to ensure that economic security, particularly social security income support, is included in the new national plan?
Minister?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you do as well. I know from women in the community that I represent that that kind of work is really essential to their well-being and to their recovery, so thank you. I would hope that the national plan would look at the before, during and after leaving, and that after leaving is the really important part that we're talking about here, that after women leave, as single mothers. They're plunged into poverty. They have all of these systems against them. The family court system re-traumatises and re-traumatises them. So I would hope that the report does that. I think it's been made very clear by ministers responsible, Amanda Rishworth and Tony Burke, that a Labor government is committed to doing more in this space, introducing the domestic and family violence paid leave, for example, which I know personally from my own experience walking into my boss's office and saying, I think I'm going to have to go to a refuge tonight, and him saying, well, what, does that mean you're not coming to work tomorrow? That is going to make a huge difference for women who are at that point. Can I just jump in there, though, because we did hear from Amanda Rishworth today that JobKeeper is going to stay at $46 a day, and yet tax cuts will still go through to the highest paid workers here in Australia of around about, being paid now a break of $25 a day. We know you survived domestic violence, you lived as a single mother in borderline poverty. You surely can't believe that it has to stay there. Honestly, I could not live on $46 a day.
I'm sorry, I think I may have said JobKeeper, right? JobSeeker is what I meant
and
to
say.
say.
I couldn't raise 2 children on $46 a day, right? But there are other payments, but I couldn't have done it without other payments. I couldn't have done it without things like rental assistance, with the family assistance, with affordable and quality childcare, for example, to look after my children and educate my children. I couldn't have done it without all of those other supports that are available. But coming back to the national plan, my hope for the national plan is that it will look forward. I mean, we started this conversation saying that the national plan doesn't look at what happens after women leave, doesn't look at that poverty piece. Okay. My hope is that it will.
Well, we should talk more than hopes, I think. And Anne Summers, you are explicit in the report that identifying payments that are inadequate and that also force women, onto lower payments. Tell the minister this evening what should be increased, what actually is going to be part of the solution to what you've uncovered in the data.
Well, certainly the recommendations, to my report, the number one recommendation is that single parents, and including single mothers, of course, should be taken off JobSeeker immediately and put back onto the parenting payment, regardless of the age of their child, until the child is 16. I also argue that the parenting payment is inadequate and it needs to be raised to the level of the single age pension, and that would bring it to something like about $980 a fortnight, which is a good $300 or $400 more than they're currently getting. Still not a lot of money, but certainly more likely to be able to eat on it than current payments. So, I mean, they're my main recommendations. They're very specific, and governments could do them tomorrow if they chose to. And they're not that expensive compared with some of the other things.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
With your recommendation, does that do you suggest that Aboriginal women, single women who have just left violent relationships, be taken off the Indue cards? That's not a recommendation?
No, it's not.
Oh, well.
We're abolishing the Indue card.
Huh?
The Labor government is abolishing the Indue card.
When's this going to happen?
I think it's in train.
Right. Also, just a suggestion, the Labor government should defund the police, give that money to the community organisations, defund prisons that are incarcerating my people. I just want to mention, whilst I've got the space, right now, Aboriginal youths are being removed from Banksia Youth Detention Centre in Western Australia and being incarcerated in maximum security in an adult prison right now. Defund the prisons, abolish prisons and defund the police.
Let's get to our next question now, and it comes from Wandana Aurora.
I moved to Australia 8 years back, and I'm from India. Imagine you're in a relationship with someone who's exerting total financial coercive control over you, as you live here alone, several hours away from any family in India, in a culture that venerated men, or at the very least women with children. And you're someone who is traumatized after a devastating miscarriage. What is Australia doing for migrants, as myself from India and Asia, especially women in abusive relationships, to help them live with the stigma and erosion of self-esteem? What am I to tell other women in Australia and about Australia? That it let me down or rallied me to get me on my feet and supported me?
Thanks for your question. Arman, I want to turn to you first on that.
Yeah, I think that layer of cultural and linguistic diversity is one that we're, I guess, from my experiences, we're still trying to sort of understand. And the services that are out there, some of them do a great service and obviously address the needs, but there's a little bit more work that needs to be done in that space, I think.
Minister?
In 2007, I wrote a report entitled No Place to Go. And that was about culturally and linguistically diverse women in Western Australia and domestic violence. That was 15 years ago, and nothing has changed. You are absolutely right. And I want to raise two issues here. The first one is women on partner visas who are being abused, whether it's coercive control or whether it's violence, and the lack of services for them because they are not citizens. And the second one is the Hague Convention. Right now, we have Australian women fleeing abusive relationships from overseas, coming home to the safety of Australia. The Hague Convention, if they get Hagued, if the other partner raises the Hague Convention, he gets all of his legal fees paid by Australia. And the Hague Convention does not recognise family and domestic violence as a grave danger to the child. We are returning women to abusive relationships, to abusive situations. 80% of Hague cases now are women fleeing domestic violence.
Are there any changes or any legislation that your government's considering in order to counter this?
Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney-General, has committed to reviewing the Hague Convention. All it needs is a change to the Family Law Act, to the part about the Hague Convention, to ensure that magistrates and judges and courts take into account family and domestic violence as a factor in returning a child and a mother to an abusive relationship. This comes on the tail of, in 2008, a woman named Cassandra Hasanovic was returned from Australia to an abusive relationship in the UK. A year later, she was dead.
I actually just wanted to bring in an observation I know that you've made in the past about the culture of equal share parenting in family law, vastly reducing women's abilities to make safe decisions. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of that comes into the challenges particularly faced by culled women. That's at the heart of a lot of the problems here too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's an assumption in our jurisdiction and in our society that actually is the best outcome, of course, for everyone.
Yeah,
is it
precisely.
an incorrect one?
And it basically what's happened over the past, particularly since 2006 and the Howard reforms, that year the Howard government sure took a sledgehammer to the independence of women and their children in so many ways, but particularly with the Family Law Act. And presumption of equal shared parental responsibility, but also the introduction of a provision that no longer exists but still I think exists in the culture of the court, which was the hostile parent provision, which was later termed the victim's dilemma, which was to say that if you raise abuse allegations, you are getting in the way of meaningful contact between the parent and the child. And so the reason why I bring that up is that this presumption of equal shared parental responsibility, what it's done it has changed the court from a place in which child safety was a priority to a place where contact must be arranged and allegations of violence are inconvenient and get in the way of that contact. We know from coronial inquests, the Hannah Clark coronial inquest, the role that equal shared parental responsibility and the expectation of that women have and that their partners have can lead women to make unsafe choices about providing access because they're afraid they'll be taken to family court. I spoke to a woman who's now a magistrate. She was a barrister at the time. And she stayed in her marriage for 10 years because she stayed there as a supervisor because she knew she could not trust the family law system to protect her child and that there was every chance that child would be ordered into shared custody arrangements.
Let me just quickly go back to you if I can, Wandana. Do you feel that Australia has let you down?
I don't think so. I've had a number of really, really good friends and family. The legal system, they've all really rallied behind me to put me back on my feet. However, the justice has been long and slow and arduous. So that's something which I'm a little disappointed with. So I did not get justice in my court case. I walked away from several $1 million because I chose to live a life of peace, and I want to live and I want to sleep peacefully at night.
Can I just make a point here?
Quickly, Anne.
When I went to the judge to seek a restraining order after I had been beaten black and blue, the judge looked at me and he said, "Do you really want this? Surely your culture has ways of dealing with this."
I was told that to a minister.
That cultural excuse persists. That cultural defence persists.
Let me move on to our next question now. And it's a video one. It comes from Katrina Harrison.
My name is Katrina Harrison. I'm a strong Palawa woman. I've had years of family violence and now I work in the sector. It's traumatic to live with family violence, but it's even more so traumatic to be forced to walk through a broken racist system. My question is, what will it take to support women escaping violence, particularly Aboriginal women?
Veronica, let's get you to answer that question.
Well, firstly, we've got to stop police misidentifying us as perpetrators. So we don't have, as Aboriginal victims, we don't have the luxury of forethinking the process of family courts. We're also thinking about our criminal matters as well, from being incarcerated, wrongfully incarcerated.
Yeah, and you've made a really interesting point in the past, actually, Veronica, about how Aboriginal women are often seen in that situation of leaving, fleeing, or complaining of family violence as a bad victim. What do you mean by the bad
we're
victim?
not good victims. We're not believed, and I think it's
you're not the right kind of victim.
Yeah, we're not the right. We're not the white victim. White is right? But also, I want to raise the case, and I'll use this as an example. Tamika Mulloway and you know this case. It was on your show in episode 2. See What You Made Me Do. And while I appreciate that you brought that her particular story to attention, the media attention that it deserved, because all too often you don't hear about the incidences that are happening to Aboriginal people, because we don't make the news.
Veronica, can I take you back to the question? As someone who knows this area well, who's worked as a police officer, who's escaped family violence, who's been come from a family a place of violence yourself as a young person, what are the policy changes you would like to see? What are the settings changes that your community need?
Well, in relation to Aboriginal people, we don't want police coming to us. We don't even call police, for Christ's sakes, because we know the likelihood of us getting arrested is really high. So, and usually the first people we ring or telephone when we have crisis is our family anyway, and that's cultural. So I think more money should be given to Aboriginal organisation that's culturally appropriate, that we trust. In Victoria right now we have JIRA, that's a Aboriginal family violence-led organisation, and we have a men's healing one that addresses in some cases, the perpetrators, and that's Dadi Manwaro. So more funding should be provided to these Aboriginal organisations.
As an example of what you're speaking about, I know that in your personal history, your child, I think, was handed to the partner you were fleeing, and was taken off with the partner. And
it was, because obviously I didn't make a good victim, but and what people who have never experienced family violence is that when you're in a relationship and you've been forced to be submissive, compliant, and you're seen and not heard, that when police do attend, in particular when it's Aboriginal people, and it's, by the way, I wasn't calling the police, they were called to the situation, it's our opportunity, we take that opportunity to speak up. And so we're seen to be hysterical, we're seen and deemed to be suffering from a mental illness, and we're treated like shit. And our children are taken from us.
We've heard from many of you in particularly vulnerable communities, and we want to represent as many voices as we can tonight. So our next question comes from Kat Reid.
Hi everyone. I am a board member of Women with Disabilities Australia and the CEO of Women with Disabilities ACT. And we know across Australia, women and girls with disability experience significantly higher forms of all forms of violence than non-disabled women, including many that remain legal and state-sanctioned, such as forced sterilisation and other forms of reproductive violence. While Australia has policies, frameworks, and services to address violence against women, many of these use narrow definitions of domestic and family violence, which means that women with disability and the types of gender-based violence we experience are excluded. My question for the panel tonight is, how can we ensure that women with disability are meaningfully included and the forms of gender-based violence we experience, including domestic and family violence, are addressed?
Thanks for that question. Anne Summers, I'll turn to you on that.
Well, this is something that I do raise in my report, and one of the most disturbing figures, in fact, in the report is the rate of disability amongst women who have experienced physical and sexual violence. The rate is, I just must check it, is 45% of the women in this survey suffered a physical or an intellectual disability, compared with 18% for the entire population. One of the questions that I ask and can't be answered from this, because this is a cross-sectional survey, it only gets information from a certain point of time. It doesn't give you what happened before and what happened after. But the extent of the disability is so severe, particularly the physical disability, and it seems to me it correlates so closely with the descriptions of physical violence that are meted out towards women in these family situations, that there has to be a cause and effect there. So I think that we need urgent study, urgent investigation into the extent to which the disabilities are the result of domestic violence. They also can then become a cause of domestic violence, because we know that women who experience disabilities are then often that triggers violence in their partner, even if he's the person, or even particularly if he's the person who has caused the disability in the first place. So I think it's a really hugely important issue, and it's one that needs to be investigated. And
we'll need sort of formal data collection and tracking in order to make sure that the extent of the issue is known and that the numbers are actually counted.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me move on to our next question. It comes from Gerard Dewhurst.
Studies around the world show that domestic violence in same-sex and/or queer couples have similar or higher rates than heterosexual couples. How can Australia even begin to address this when our most recent census continued the long legacy of excluding us?
Jess Hill, can I turn to you on that one?
Yeah, it's shocking. I can't believe that in 2022 we had a census without actually tracking the data of that. Especially, it's, you know, this is not sort of a small community. I think it's something like there's data that's around 10% of Australians will identify as LGBTQIA+. And you're right, and the studies on the prevalence of violence also, it ranges so widely that it's hard to sort of sit on a number. Really, when we're talking about family violence, intimate partner violence, coercive control, we're talking about a system of power over. And that system can be established by anyone. In heterosexual couples, when it's a real system of coercive control, it tends to be more the male who does that over the female. When there's aggression, it can be much more equal. But in LGBTQIA+ relationships, establishing that power over is just as achievable, and it is just as prevalent, as you say. And really, I tend to take, I know this is a very outdated word, but it's come back into vogue. I tend to, rather than look at just the gendered nature of violence, I look at the patriarchal nature of violence. And I think sometimes when we look at gender inequality as the framework through which we're trying to reduce violence, whilst that can have some knock-on positive effects for people in that community, really we're missing the bigger picture. Gender inequality is a symptom of patriarchy, and under, as you know, Bell Hooks puts it, like white, capitalist, heteronormative, there's a few other words in there, patriarchy, that system of power over is implicit and ingrained in the culture. And there's so many different ways in which power over is achieved in those relationships. Some of them bear a lot of resemblance to heterosexual relationships, but there are often, you know, unique traits like threatening to out someone, threatening to disclose an HIV status, or even just the threat of exclusion from a community that, even in Sydney, is tight. And once you're excluded, the exile and isolation is intense.
Let me get to some other questions. And our next one comes from Ian Lawton.
Thank you. Yeah, the panel's spoken quite a bit tonight about poverty, and I want to put the idea of early intervention into a broader context, and that is generational. So I wonder if the panel has any suggestions for how we could do better as a society at supporting family networks in breaking the cycles of violence.
Arman, let me turn to you on this, because you've said something that really shocked me when I learnt of your reflections on this, given what you grew up with and what your father did to your mother. And you said that if your dad hadn't killed your mother, that you probably would have turned out to be a different person. What do you mean?
Well, I think I got to a point where when we fled our family home, I was about 21, and I started to very slowly connect the dots, essentially, and look at our situation and how we ended up and why we ended up in the situation that we were in. And it was all, I guess, it was all related to the 21 years of controlling behaviour, manipulation, financial abuse, emotional abuse. All of that sits underneath, and I guess, the attempted murder and the murder is really at the top of the iceberg. That's what we hear about in the media, that's what we see, that's what we count. It wasn't until my mum passed away that I started to realise that some of the traits that I'd picked up from watching my parents interact and the way my dad acted, what he said, how he went about his business, I started to copy that. And I'd been doing that since my teenage years, and I could clearly see that in the relationships that I was in. So I guess I noticed that all of that abuse, the 20 years of abuse, essentially led to my dad killing my mum. And
are you saying that if that dreadful murder hadn't taken place, that you might have grown up to be an abuser yourself?
An emotional abuser, someone that was jealous, controlling, manipulative, yes. So I saw that in my early relationships. Yeah. And I had to reflect and say, this is not the right path. Just because I've been exposed to it and that's just because it happened in my family home doesn't mean that it doesn't make it right.
I don't think that's proven, though. Is it proven? No, look, because my son's witnessed a lot of violence towards me, and he is an amazing Aboriginal man.
He's reflected.
Is it proven? That if you, as a child, if you witness so much violence...
But I think this is Arman's experience, though, of how he believed, he was turning out as a result of this. So, Arman, what did you do? I mean, because I know that you're a father now with a young child, so...
I am. So what did I do? I guess in my teenage years, I started to, as relationships weren't working out, I started to reflect and look at who was at fault and what went wrong. And as I started to grow up, I started to actually understand that what was happening at home, I was essentially replicating that. And as I said, all the different forms of abuse that I had witnessed and experienced, I was recreating that in my own relationships. And so I think I got to a point where I started to realise that if I keep going down this path, chances are I'm either going to hurt my partner or do even worse. And when I saw what my dad did to my mum, that didn't happen overnight. My dad didn't just get up one night and say, I'm going to go and kill this lady. That didn't happen overnight. It took 22 years. Yeah. From my perspective, it was 22 years of abuse. And even that, it started with very subtle behaviours, and as time went on, it started to build up.
What do you tell younger people or people who might be in a similar situation to you that you were in as a young man? What advice, what leadership do you give to them on that?
Look out for early warning signs. And just because something is happening at home, that doesn't necessarily make it right. For me, I had my friends and their families, and that's where I essentially started to compare that what was happening at home, at my house, and what was happening in my friends' family places were two different things.
And you had young children. How did you make sure that you were interrupting the cycle with that generation?
I protected my children fiercely. My boys didn't know anything about what I went through until they read it in my book a couple of years ago. They had no idea.
What was their response?
I protected them fiercely. They rang me and they said, why didn't you tell us? And I said, because I didn't want you to be a part of of that world. I didn't want you to know. But, you know, I think there are, you know, the other night I was having dinner with a girlfriend, and inevitably, whenever I'm having dinner with a girlfriend, we end up talking about domestic violence. And she looked at me and she said, "What are we going to do, Anne?" And I said, "You know what? Do you reckon the men are sitting around halfway through their steak, putting down their knife and fork and going, what are we going to do about domestic violence?" I think men need to start having the conversation with men a lot more.
Let me go to our next question now, and it comes from Tara Hunter.
So the US Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade has meant abortion is now illegal for many Americans. It's likely that domestic violence perpetrators will use this ruling as part of violence and coercion against their victims. In Australia, we know that abortion still sits in the criminal code in Western Australia, and we also know that it's inaccessible for many people due to the cost and the location. So just interested in thoughts around how we support people who are affected by reproductive coercion.
Can I come to you on that first?
Could you repeat it? Because I've lost the mic and I can't hear.
So
just repeat.
Let me help you, absolutely. It's about the Roe versus Wade decision in the United States, the Supreme Court decision, and how there can be better support for victims, survivors of reproductive coercion, people who have been forced to carry children to term that they didn't want to carry in the first place. And I guess to ensure that it doesn't actually happen over here in Australia as it has in America.
You hear about those cases where women are like in violent relationships and they're told not to take any birth control. And I think that's a way of keeping them in that relationship by getting them pregnant and then making them feel like they need to be like the child needs both parents. So that's happening. But it's really sad what's happening over in the US at the moment. It's pretty much a dictatorship. And for the women over there or anyone that's have uteruses, it's like they don't have autonomy over their own body part.
I want to ask Anne Summers, you're a close watcher of American politics. You spent a long time there and you've worked out of the highest office in the land here as an advisor to Paul Keating. Is it possible that this sort of anti-abortion push could actually take fire here in Australia?
Well, I would like to think not, and I do think there are such significant differences between the two countries. I mean, abortion has always been, you know, at least for the last 50 years, an issue that has divided Americans in ways that are quite incomprehensible in this country. I mean, in this country, something like 70 or 80% of people believe abortion should be legal and available. So that's not to deny that there are issues of access, particularly in large states like Queensland and Western Australia.
And affordability, yeah.
And affordability, though it is covered by Medicare in most situations, I believe. There's also access to RU486 to non-surgical forms of abortion increasingly, and that's helpful. But I think the problem with the United States is that, and the thing that makes me so kind of angry about it, is that the Republicans have been saying for 50 years they were going to do this. And then they made it a litmus test in all their judicial appointments, local courts, federal courts, Supreme Court. They finally got the Supreme Court. They made it a litmus test in the pre-selection of all their members of Parliament, members of Congress, state, local, federal level. They said we're going to do it, and they've done it.
So why should anyone be surprised?
Why didn't we stop it? Why didn't we stop it? I mean, I'm just baffled by the attitude of the Democrats and their inability to match the Republicans' evil intent. I just find it extraordinary. But I do not think that the same thing would happen in Australia.
And Ali, do you?
I just wanted to go back to something that Kat said, because Kat made a very important point here where she said the narrow definition of family and domestic violence. And if we look at coercive control, that needs to be in the definition of family and domestic violence, financial control, including and as well control that forces women to carry to term children that whether it's through a rape or whatever. I think that if we were to, if we want to talk about prevention, we do really need to broaden what we talk about when we talk about family and domestic violence, incorporate all of those different forms of abuse in it.
So reproductive coercion should actually be included as a term, as a recognised form of abuse.
I think,
Is that something
I think
that you
we need to
consider
look at.
including in the government's policy?
I've just had that idea now, so maybe I'll... Thanks, Pat.
Ideas, personally.
Jess, did you want to jump in there?
Oh, I just want, I think there's some data in Anne's report that talks about the fact that for so many women, and I'm sorry, the number fails me, but it might not fail you, Anne, that pregnancy is the first time violence occurs. And there was a woman in the book that I wrote who talked about she'd had a really supportive partner, believed in her independence and gender equality, and then the day she announced that she was pregnant, he turned on a dime and became one of the most terrifying coercive controllers and users of physical and sexual violence that I've practically ever heard. Now, there are so many, a lot of people feel like, well, why would you have a baby to him? Why would you do that? It's like, for a lot of women, they won't even find out that their partner is emotionally or physically or sexually abusive until they are pregnant.
And there's a resounding yeses in the room, so clearly a lot of lived experience of that.
And why is this? And why, why does this happen?
And what drives that?
What drives that, and how do we stop it?
Let's go to our final question tonight. It comes from Robin Evans.
As a representative of Baptist Care, who provides wraparound support services to victims and behaviour change and case management services to perpetrators of domestic and family violence, we are interested to know how services helped or hindered the process of change. What made a difference? What can we do better?
So let's go around the panel on that, about the existing services like BapCare and others. Have they been helpful or not, and what could they do better in order to move to pick up the conversation that Anne has kicked off with this research and to actually make a difference? Jess, I'll start with you.
Look, it's broad because services are so broad, and there's everything from the best and most sensitive to the worst and re-traumatising. I'd say one thing I would just offer is to really pay attention not just to children but individual children in each family. They all have vastly different experiences and may be facing violence from siblings. I just think really paying attention to kids is the best, the best thing services could do.
Arman, we'll take one suggestion from each of you, given time is tight.
I think engaging with men a little bit better. Because men are, look at this panel, I'm the only man here speaking about domestic violence, but engaging with men more meaningfully and trying to genuinely engage them in a conversation, that's probably what I would say.
Veronica?
I've forgotten the question, sorry. Repeat again, sorry.
About how service providers who are working in this space to try and help victims of family abuse, what they can do better.
Give victims more money to help them survive. It's not a Band-Aid approach. Don't just fix it for the day, fix them for the future. Give them more money, and I know it's out of your hands. You're limited with what you guys can do. Set women or the families up to succeed and not to fail.
And Ali?
All of those.
Yeah, thank you.
All of those things, and not. Be responsive to cultural and linguistic needs, particularly cultural needs of women from different cultural or religious backgrounds.
Anne Summers.
Well, I'd certainly agree with everything that's been said, but the other thing I'd add is that we spend all our time studying women. All of my research is based on abuse of women, and it's very important that we understand the extent, the depth of that and how much worse it is than we thought it was. And I hope that these terrible numbers will prompt some attention in Canberra. But what we don't study are perpetrators. And I really think that we must have more, we need to know more about these men, who they are, why they do it, how they do it. We need longitudinal studies that follow these guys so we understand it better.
And that's all that we have time for tonight. So please thank our wonderful panel, Anne Summers, Anne Ali, Veronica Gorrie, Arman Abrahimzadeh and Jess Hill. And thank you for your questions and for sharing such personal stories with us, and to you at home for joining the conversation as well. And we should point out that Anne's full report can be found on our website. Now, as we end the program, while we've been talking, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's resignation appears imminent. He's just about to give a speech at any moment, and he's expected to announce that he's quitting as Conservative Party leader. So No comment from me on that. Stay across ABC News Services for updates throughout this evening and, of course, all our news services tomorrow morning with the latest. And next week, our program, coincidentally, will focus on foreign affairs, and David Spears will be with you looking at how Australia's international relationships are shaping up under an Albanese government. So he'll be joined by Ukrainian Ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Miroshnichenko, academic and author Carly Moore-Gilbert, who spent 2 years in an Iranian jail, and strategic studies expert Hugh White. And you can join me tomorrow morning on ABC Radio Melbourne. So good night, go well.